The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Merry meet and merry part, bright the cheeks and warm the heart, but tread the circle thrice about to keep unwelcome spirits out. Bide within the law you must, in perfect love and perfect trust. Mind the threefold laws you should, 3 times bad and 3 times good. These 8 words the read fulfill, and ye harm none, do what ye will.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Merry meet, everybody. Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. One of our favorite cauldron stirrers, Barry Fitzgerald, is back with us tonight after a really long absence, and that long time in between is both good and bad, because it's bad because we missed chatting with him. And several people have gotten in touch with me during that void to find out where he's been, why he hasn't been on the show, and what he's up to. And the good part of it all is that he's here to do just that. And he's been up to a lot of things that we'll hear about in just a minute. And if you're listening live in the Para X chat room, and you want to ask Barry all those questions that I couldn't answer, send me a private message. Or if you're brave enough, you can leave the message in the main chat room and hope I see it before it gets swept away. And if you're not in the Para X chat room and you want to find us, come over to paraxradionetwork.com. Barry, how nice to have you back.
Good morning, Marla, and thank you very much for having me on again.
By popular demand, me and everybody else. We had to drag you back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of catching up to do.
Yes.
And I know there's a few projects that you've been working on, and we'll get to that in a little while.
Sure.
Because, it's very tempting. Let me just say that there's a second edition of a book. There's another book coming out in March, and something else that you describe as a mind bender. But,
yes.
Yeah. But knowing you, you're never stagnant, and I'm sure that you've always got a few things going on as well as what, I know. And while some people were asking, where's Waldo, as they used to do, there were a lot of people asking, where's Barry? Some people thought you might have stepped away for a well-deserved breather. Others thought maybe you were, doing something out of the para arena, or maybe you just got kidnapped. But you're here in one piece, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to throw it over to you to explain.
Thank you very much, Marla. And I think maybe a little bit of everything there may have been thrown into the mix. But certainly from my perspective, I did step away because of the work that I was doing into the research. And I needed to focus heavily on that. And of course this was coming on the back of the ensuing pandemic that we all were facing. So I finished my time visiting Skinwalker Ranch, and I just got back into Ireland, and that's whenever we were forced into lockdown. And so that in itself was taking its toll, and there was a lot of things happening here in Ireland. But on the back of that, there was still a lot of good work that was being done, a lot of good research, and that has led to the release, the approaching release of The Deceptions of Gods and Men, which is a publication. We signed the contracts and everything else, and it looks like it's being released on March 2022. And that particular book really was an exploration into what are these things behind the veil. A lot of the things that we encounter, we're never quite sure. There's a different mask that may appear on them. Yet, when we track them by phenomena, the way that they interact with us, that in itself is almost identical globally. So you've got the Australians, you've got the South Africans, and Peruvians. They're all experiencing pretty much the same thing, but they're interpreting it differently. And whether that be our own interpretations or whether that be the interpretations in which they wish to be seen. And that's a very important one to understand. But when we follow them via phenomena, the way they interact with us, that's how we were able to track it. And that's how I was able to piece everything together and release this particular publication that explores this and puts a hypothesis forward as to what these things really are. That has been an exploration of its own, something which was it took its toll. I gotta say, and even when writing this with my co-author Brian Allen over in Scotland, we suffered even with that because of technical issues and strange issues with the publication and going back and forward. Things just weren't working the way that they were meant to work. It was as if someone behind there was working with the technology and was really determined not to let us release this. But we got there in the end, and we're really looking forward to having this out there. Between that and the next release of the Banshee, and of course Halloween is approaching us very fast as well, and so the Banshee will be coming out, and I'd like to explore the Banshee as well in regards to what we now know of the Banshee, where she comes from, and the true meanings of the word and the etymology of the word, that is explored in this next publication as well.
That was one of my favorite books, by the way.
Mm-hmm. The Banshee itself, she always got a bad rap, and I always felt no, there's something more about the Banshee that needs to be explored, and certainly that we started to uncover, and we started to show that the Banshee was not the bad person. It's like don't shoot the messenger, and that's exactly what she was. She was a messenger, but now we understand things better, and now we understand who she belongs to, and where they're coming from, and this we're able to put heritage to it and history, and we're able to see that this goes back not just hundreds of years, but this goes back thousands of years, and that particular phenomenon, who she belongs to, is explored within the book as well. But in particular, we really should look at this aspect of stone, because stone and the Banshee go hand in hand. Now, when you start looking at this phenomena, the rest of the world would understand as being the fairy, but in the Irish sense, we call them the she. Now, that would mean Banshee, if we broke the word down, is woman of the fairy. But that's actually not quite right, because she, in the Irish sense, is in reference to the ancient Neolithic passage chambers. These tombs that dot across the land have been built thousands of years. In fact, they were built before the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. Now, these particular chambers, this is where she comes from. These chambers are made of huge masses of stone, and the she itself is the mounds. So when we go back and we look at the translation, it's woman of of the mounds. This creature is coming through the stone, these gateway points into this reality. And this is something which has been happening for a very, very long time.
You know, when you said stone, I immediately thought of Medusa. I thought maybe she was a relative of Medusa or something, or maybe the snakes, you know. But no,
poor Medusa. Medusa was another one. No, she ended up getting a very, very bad rap, and it was one of the gods had his wicked way with her, and then she was punished because she had this. She was assaulted by one of the gods. I thought it was a terrible thing, a terrible story of poor Medusa, and of course then the way that she ended up. It's strange how these stories can take a life of their own. But no, the stone itself is exceptionally important. And when we look at this aspect of, say, the fairy realm, for instance, we find that stone is exceptionally important. If we take the word, for instance, goblin. Now, goblin, of course, from an English perspective, is this little creature, an ugly little creature, that can cause all sorts of trouble. But goblin is derived from Old French, which is gobelin, which in itself is derived from Old Germanic terms, which is kob. So when we look at kob and translate kob means hole in stone. So again, we're finding this aspect of these things coming through the stone and through the rocks and through the rock faces. And isn't it very strange as well, you being in the United States, that David Paulides, the author of Missing 411, has also commented that a lot of the people that go missing under strange, very, very strange circumstances, the majority of them go missing in boulder fields. So again, we're back to the stone. And this is where we start finding this very unusual phenomena, where the phenomena is the same, the interaction is the same, it's just the mask that changes, the way that we identify it. And like I said before, when we try and follow the mask, the likes of goblin or troll, or whatever the case may be, we end up coming to a dead end. We simply, it doesn't work because the mask continually changes. That's the deception. But the way that they interact with us is where we find the truth. And that's what we did with that particular book, The Deceptions of God and Men. And we were also able to see how certain people have now started utilizing this connection with them to their benefit. And that really plays out within the book to shocking, absolute shocking data that really does force us to look at what we're doing as a species right around the world.
It's always, I mean, back into cave times and cave dwellers and hieroglyphics and everything. I mean, it seems like everything kind of started with stone in a strange way.
Yeah, well, even within the fields of ufology, you also find this strange connection. You've got like whales, for instance. There was a case there of this UFO that flew into the side of the mountain. There are cases in the United States where UFOs are seen flying in and out of rock faces. Mm-hmm. So what are these rock faces? What's special about them? What's special about the rock that these things are coming through on? There have been some comments from the likes of NASA and things like that say that space is unusually quiet. And I'm not aware as of yet of any data that has shown a craft coming from space to Earth. Certainly plenty around it, but not coming from the depth of space to this planet. It seems that they're coming out of the planet. So again, we're back to this situation where there's something going on under our feet that we may have forgotten, because our ancestors certainly were dealing with it all those years ago. And they too, it would seem, history would suggest, went through this great reset.
Yeah, and you're talking, and I'm sitting here listening and thinking about rocks, and the first wheel was made from stone, and and tools were made from stone. I mean, it pays a great deal into our evolution, and taking us away from being incapable of doing anything by, okay, here's a tool, we'll do this, the flint and all that. And then if you want to take a step farther and talk about the process of rocks or whatever, quartz is it telegrams and gets it back, gives back and forth. So it's almost alive in a sense. You can send and receive with quartz and maybe lots of other kinds of rocks also, no?
Well, when you start looking at this aspect of things communicating through the rock, then we start seeing this phenomena in which our ancestors, and right up to the present day, still some processes that occur where people are experiencing interaction with these things, which are close to rock. So the likes of some very, very good seances, of course, have happened, which I've been studying here in Europe. And they were happening in basements of houses, where these portals, if you like, were opening up, and people were able to see the portal open up, and these things would appear. And it's interesting to see that during these particular experiments, that they had to be in complete darkness, because these things, they believed, the sitters were told that the light would destroy them, would destroy these entities coming through, and they needed complete darkness. So during the sittings, they would feel the hands, these cold hands, touch them as and some type of offering of proof of their existence. The experiments continued, and of course they began appearing on film, being recorded in audio. But again, it was always pretty much in darkness. So what was it they were hiding? Why was there any aspect of truth behind the fact that they needed the darkness to appear? It would seem not, because I was able to find the same things that were happening in Livermore laboratories in the United States to a bunch of scientists there some years before the experiments that were happening in England. And these entities were appearing in broad daylight. So it's one rule for one and one rule for another. So again, we're being told these alleged truths are being whispered, and we're taking them on board, but we're not questioning whether they are true or not. All we have to do is do a little bit of digging, and then we find out, wait a minute, something's not quite right here. And that pretty much is what I have been doing over the past several years. I've been really delving into this particular process and finding out, where are the irregularities? Where are the misquotes? Where is the deception within all of this? And believe me, Marla, you don't have to dig too far before you start finding that. And it has been an intriguing path to discover and find out that possibly what we're dealing with from a ufological perspective, from the paranormal, from fairies, folklore, mythology, we actually may be looking at the same thing, the same face of the coin, just from a different perspective. We've been dealing with the same thing all along.
You know, it's funny how people from all over different cultures can look at the same thing, can have so many different explanations for it. Maybe part of it is religious. Some of it could just be information handed down from generation to generation to generation. But it's not, everybody says everything is different, but you're kind of saying that it's pretty much the same. It's just the way that you look at it or try and interpret it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm challenging, is for us to step back and to stop pigeonholing, trying to pigeonhole the phenomena, step back from it and see the greater picture. And when we do that, that's whenever we find this thread, this common thread that runs through many of the research paths. And, there is, I'll give you an instance, there is a case where when dealing with fairy lore, for instance, the mythology of fairy lore and things, that these things will stay away from you if you have iron in your possession. Cold iron. And that has always been the case. And when you go back and you look at the mythology of this particular aspect, we find out that iron, of course, is used to deflect the effects of the evil eye. If your child, unbaptized child, was left in the crib, you left iron tongs over the crib to stop the fairy from stealing the child. It was always about the iron. Now, when we go back and we start going back deeper into the likes of, say, the legends of Solomon's Temple and things like that in the Middle East, we find that the jinn did not want any tools that were made of iron. Again, we start seeing the same phenomena, just on a different mask. And from my own experiences, I have to say, in what has led me to this particular point, I've had my experiences with these beings that have came into my bedroom at night and tried to have this interaction. But because I was wearing iron around my neck, they were afraid to come near me. The reasons why is because they couldn't shut me down. I was able to move. And because I'm able to move, they were afraid. Now, these things, when you look at them in appearance, you could say, maybe 100, 200 years ago, you would say, oh, that's the Fae. The Fae have come to the house. But to me, in a modern sense, I was looking at four greys. The same phenomena, different mask. And when we go back and we see that there is a common factor as well with the phenomena of, say, the jinn and night attacks, these incubus and succubus attacks, again, we end up back at iron. Because 9 times out of 10, these incubus and succubus attacks will attack women more so than men, because they target the women during their monthly cycle. So when their natural iron levels deplete, so many of them become anemic. That's when they strike. So again, we're back to iron. And we're also crossing into the Middle Eastern aspect because we're now talking about jinn, which in itself is also fairy, is also the grey phenomena. So we find this again, and again we find within the jinn, within the fairy, within the ufology, we find this connection to rocks. So again, they're coming from under our feet. They're coming from somewhere else. I don't mean a hollow earth. I'm not talking about that. This is almost something. The work would almost suggest that this is almost dimensional. It's as if they're coming from somewhere else, and that's something that we explore within the Deceptions of Gods and Men, and also we delve into this aspect of the Shining Ones, these entities that appear and give us all this palaver and information, and we should be looking after each other, and all this stuff. But it was interesting to note that when we get a spate of these shining ones appearing, which for many, of course, would have a basis in religion, when these things appear, they usually start appearing 10 years before a major global conflict. So these things are starting to warm up before it happens. So are they causing it, or are they just simply be prepared that it's coming?
I've had people come on the show talking about the benevolent ETs, the aliens, the Palladians, for example, all dressed in white, nice and,
Yes.
whatever. Is that kind of who you're talking about when you refer to the shining ones?
Well, let's not get me started on the Palladians.
We might just do that after the break, but for the moment, yes.
Well, if it's any consolation, I think I know where the Palladians come from, and it's not the star system.
Well, that's interesting.
Yes, again, another sleight of hand on their part, and I think it comes back to a particular island chain off the coast of Turkey, and looking at the ancient manuscripts and things they got describe these particular things that were going on, we tended to find that worship of these beings tended to happen in hard to reach places, islands, on top of mountains, temples high in the mountains, or deep in the forests, or underground and cave systems. They were always hard to reach places. But the problem was, Marta, is that the human race adapted wonderfully well to its environment. So we spread, and when we spread, they had to retract back, and they keep retracting further and further and further. And for the Palladians, well, they certainly had it wrapped up well whenever they said that they came from the star system, because that's a place that we could not reach. So we had to stop looking. But in itself, I believe that they were coming from a particular island chain that in itself was, one of the islands was a main worship site, an old pagan site. And that's where I believe that they had come from, because of the number of islands that were representative of the Pallades, and also what was happening on that particular stretch of water. You see, that water itself, when it was translated into water of whispers, and again was also a phenomenon of the way that they interacted with us. They spoke to us, they whispered to us, they guided us, and then when we consider this, that they started interacting with us and the way that they interacted with us, again we find ourselves back in the Middle East. We find ourselves back in the likes of Palmyra in Syria, back in the BC, where we employed these things to guide us across the desert, because there were good jinn and there were bad jinn. So we employed the good jinn to defend us from the bad jinn. Now this is pre-Islamic. I'm not talking about during the time of Muhammad and things like that. I'm talking pre-Islam. And to me it sounded a bit like a racket, to be honest, which amused me to no end. But this idea that at one time we did work hand in hand, but something went wrong. Something happened, and things started to stop being. The cooperation stopped being there, and it's also interesting as well when we consider that these things worked in whisper and things like that, and the very word in itself, when we understand from a Roman perspective, which had a great influence in Palmyra, within a Roman perspective, for someone who was good with the arts, whether it be writing, poetry, storytelling, artistry, or plays or whatever the case may be. If you were good at that, it was often said, so you were listening to your genius. Now, that originates from genie, from jinn, which was a voice outside of the body. Now genius, which of course now is something which we see as inward, was always seen as something outward. So that distortion happened, and we now see genius as being something which is inside. But it is interesting when you go back and you start looking at all these different little telltales, these little indicators that show that that things are slightly different, askewed the way that we see the past. It has been a real eye opener for me anyway, to go down that path and track these things back.
And we'll get right back to talking about it in just about 2 minutes, and we're going to take a real quick break. So everybody, hang in.
Stirring the Cauldron will be right back, so don't go away.
If you end up with webbed feet,
remember, you've been warned. Missed an episode of Stirring the Cauldron? Then be sure to check out marlabrooks.com and check out the archive. And while you're there, check out Marla's weekly Witches Oracle card reading. Explore the site to find many great resources, such as information on tarot, oracle readings, metaphysical consultations, and links to all of Marla's books. That's marlabrooks.com.
Rat, where are you going?
I'm going back to the paranormal view, back where I belong.
Please, take me with you.
No, I'm through with everything here. I want to see if there's something left in life I haven't explored. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, Rat, don't run to them. They talk about ghosts and hauntings, UFOs, and all kind of supernatural scary stuff.
You'll never understand, will you, Scarlet?
No.
Well, that's your misfortune.
Rat, if you go, where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear... Line.
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
That's the Paranormal View with your host, Henry Foister, Jeffrey Gould, and Barbara Duncan. Every Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the Para X Radio Network.
Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
And my guest tonight is Barry Fitzgerald, and we're talking about a lot of different things, catching up with him, and we're going to continue to be talking about all these things. But Barry, how do you sleep at night? You have so much knowledge in your head. How do you turn it off?
I write it down. The moment that I write it down, it's fine, and my office is covered in sticky notes. And it really has been amazing, an amazing journey. Now, don't get me wrong. Whenever I say that, a lot of the stuff has a level of deception, there is some that I have found that have had positive interactions, and I know for myself, there are clues which are set across my path that I would never have found on my own. Something else has set those down, and those I take note of a lot, and that has been very, 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 very interesting to follow, and also I question that particular input time and time again, because I think it's something very, very, very important. I don't give over to it fully. I always have that aspect of doubt, but I think that's healthy. Mm-hmm. I think it's healthy to have that doubt, and realize that at any moment, trust is earned. It's not given out willy-nilly, and it can be taken away exceptionally fast. So up until now, there has been a certain level of trust, but like I said, that could be taken away if I find something that isn't quite right. So far, and this has been going on years.
Yeah.
That so far it's been true enough for me, and I just continue on doing what I do. But for me, the big thing for me is this connection back to our ancestors, back to this time of the Neolithic, 4,000-5,000 BC. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by that particular time period because of the way these stone structures have been built on top of mountains and everything else, and the orientation of these chambers to the setting sun, especially on the summer solstice. And the way that the sun enters the chamber, and understanding the frequencies and everything that's involved with it, it has been absolutely tremendous.
Do you?
But,
sorry.
I
go
did.
ahead.
Mm-hmm. No,
go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Finish.
I did have a really dramatic experience on an island here in Ireland, and we called it the Island of the Dead. And 7 years later, I found out that what we called it is exactly what it was used for. And we find the clues of that idea coming from Old Norse, pre-Christian Norse traditions, which originally came through Ireland and then moved up into the Nordic regions. And you see, from an Irish perspective, we have lots of legends of serpents and things like that. And I often used to rack my brain thinking, what the hell was St. Patrick doing here, saying that he was getting rid of the serpents? Because we didn't have any bloody serpents. But of course, from a spiritual perspective, there was an element there which would have supported that belief system, and that in itself, that system was called Metapsychosis, and it related to the death of the soul and the transformation into the same or a different animal. And for the Old Norse traditions, when you had the Island of the Dead, the souls that were brought there, the bodies initially were brought, and then the soul detached from that. And where the soul was going back to, before it could go back and through the doorway, it had to go through this type of metempsychosis, which transformed it, they believed, into a serpent.
Mm.
So, and then the serpent entered this passage and went back to where it come from, which in itself was a place of nothing. It was a dimension of absolutely nothing. Hmm. And whenever I say nothing, I mean nothing. There was no male, female, there was no light, there was nothing, no feelings, nothing. And I suppose from a religious standpoint, we could definitely see this aspect of purgatory being put in there. But of course, purgatory now has been pulled from the books, according to the Vatican. So there goes that tradition. But it was very, very strange, and when we see these stone structures appear throughout Northern Europe, throughout Estonia, up into the Nordic traditions, into Norway, Sweden, Finland, and of course you also find them right down through the western coast of France, Spain, and up into Ireland and England. So this, it has had a long time to develop. But isn't it interesting that when we look at the legends of, say, for instance, the Eve and the Garden of Eden, that Eve, being female, communed with the serpent. Now again, where I say the serpent went into this place, it was a place of knowledge. You see, all of those souls that lived had access to the knowledge. So when we consider that they had access to all the lives that were lived, we would see that today as being I think they call it the Akashic records, or the global consciousness. I've also heard it being referred to. But these things have access to all of the knowledge that has been lived. So understand that, and from that particular perspective, we see within the biblical tales, we see this connection between the feminine and the serpent. And within the Old Norse traditions, it was always the female that was the seer. She was the one that worked with the veil and worked the other side. Now, the gatekeepers of that veil were serpents. So we start to see this starting to roll out across the board. And when you go into the likes of the Temple of Delphi and things like that, again, it was a female who was working with the giant serpent. And a lot of people would say, oh, it was the fumes, or whatever she was, the seer was consuming, whatever magic mushroom she was on, or whatever the case. There was nothing to do with anything like that. Really? The seer was in a cave system. We're back to rocks. The gateway was being protected by a serpent, and she was the one that gave the knowledge. Now look what happened to the connection of Eve and the serpent. That really did have an effect on the progress for females and the practice of that, because certainly within the Norse traditions, it reached a period where men took over, and they took over that particular aspect of communing with these things, and that has had a destructive path, I believe, right into the present day. So these particular these practices, a lot of them are still practiced within places around the world today by various different people, which I shan't get into. But you can go to the remote forest with your pals and buddies, and you can go through this particular process and commune with these things that told you how to govern the people. But these things always came with a tremendous price, and blood worship was definitely part of that, and we see that even when we look today, using our technology, we're able to see a lot of these particular places that we have paranormal phenomena, that we have disappearances, that we have UFO reports, that we have a lot of cryptid reports. A lot of these are connected with magnetic anomalies around the world. Now, when we understand this, we see that there is slightly two different camps within this. You have the positive anomaly and you have the negative anomaly. Now, again, we have to understand this is of the same coin. These things are the same, but we have one particular camp, which is the positive anomaly, in which we will find cattle mutilations, we will find people disappearing, like the David Paulides reports. You'll find a lot of UFO reports and things, and poltergeist hauntings and things within these areas. But in the negative magnetic anomalies, initially I stayed away from the negative anomalies until recently, and I went back looking at them to discover that these areas can have an effect on us. And it was interesting to see that 75% of the world's top suicide locations appear in these areas. And it was also interesting to see that within that a lot of our ancients used these particular areas for worship, blood worship in particular. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is one perfect example. That place is known for headhunters. Blood worship was big, and that was just one example. So we've got all these areas that are associated with blood worship, with attracting somewhat the worst in humanity, and when we understand that the blood worship occurred there in our ancient past, when we start looking at that from today's perspective, we see that 70% of the world's weapons development, manufacturing, and testing also happens in these areas. That's not by chance. That's something else going on there. And when you consider that most of Europe is in a negative anomaly, look at the world wars where they happened. The majority of them happened in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of blood that was spilt on European soil was tremendous. And when we consider that this act of blood worship is being manufactured by weapons designed in these areas, then we really should be starting to ask questions. How are these numbers adding up? What else is going on here?
Yeah. That's amazing. It truly is. And when you're talking about, all the bloodshed in Europe, the iron of the blood went into the land. Some of it turns to stone eventually, and then there's something else going on there. And there was a question earlier. Cece was asking, does lead have any kind of magical property? Do you know?
I don't know on lead because primarily I have been fixed on iron because of its connection to the past and that which was unfolding. And when we consider this aspect of iron and this aspect of us continually fighting with these things that are coming through the veil. Yes, at one time they were worshipped as gods, and we don't primarily, for the most of us, we don't primarily do that now. But it was interesting to understand that, especially from a Celtic perspective, there is a medical condition that can arise called hemochromatosis, which is the production of too much iron in the blood. Now that tends to develop around 30 or 40 years of age and can have dramatic effects on the body, which can ultimately, if left untreated, can kill the person that suffers from it. So it's the overproduction of iron. The very mineral, the very metal that allows us to defend ourselves against these things. The Neolithic passage chambers, all of these areas appear within the Celtic traditions. And we find that above anyone else in the planet, for someone who has Celtic heritage, it's more likely that they will suffer from hemochromatosis. It's something which is inherited down.
Yeah.
And it was the Celts that suffered from it the most, the very thing that they needed to fight against these things coming through the veil.
It's all fascinating. And the other thing, before we run out of time, we've talked about Banshee, we've talked about the deceptions of gods and men. Let's talk about the fruit of the gods.
Now, this particular one, this particular story started back a few years ago. And initially, I was, yourself, Marlo, you're told a story, and sometimes you hear that many stories that you're half there and half not. And I have to say, I was half not listening to this particular story. But this lady happened to say to me that her friend was visiting a site here on the west coast of Ireland, and she was a photographer, and she wanted to photograph an old famine village, an abandoned famine village up in the mountains. That's fine. I know where it was. And she said it was very, very strange because she became lost. And again, I didn't pass any heed. And she said, but it was the way that she got lost was very strange. Because fortunately enough, she had her phone with her. So she was able to phone her husband and the Gardaí, the local police, and they all arrived on the scene. And the husband said to her, "What are you doing? Why did you not just follow the path that they had walked up on?" And she said, "I couldn't find the path." Now, suddenly my ears pricked up, because that is a phenomena which the fairy use. It's called the stray sod, in which you step on a particular area of ground, and that's when they got you, and you can't find your way out of the field, and this could last right through the night until the following day before you're released. But I ended up going over the maps and having a look, and in the maps there's a description which calls it it's like the land of the mounds, the she mounds. So the she mounds were in the area that this lady got lost. So there was a connection to the fae, possibly. And I wanted to go and have a look. Now, while I was there by myself. I ended up walking through this massive forest, beautiful, beautiful forest with massive trees. And I couldn't help but notice these huge, almost pineapple-style fruit that had fallen onto the floor. And I looked at them, and I must admit, my instinct, and I listened to my instinct a lot, my instinct was screaming at me, do not touch these things. They looked completely alien to me, I must admit. And my mind was straying to what on earth were these, where did they come from, and everything else. But I didn't touch them. I returned back 2 days later, and bear in mind the forest floor was littered with these things. 2 days later, there was hardly any left. And I didn't see footprints. I didn't see any markings as to animals that would be taking them, but they were gone. And there was only a partial piece that was left 2 days later. And I picked it up. Now, the moment that I picked it up, where it touched my fingers, it felt like there was a strange sensation that was going through my fingers, where it just touched the fruit. And I didn't know what that was. And I said nothing. I brought it back to the car, and I then picked up my wife after she finished work, and she picked it up. She says, "Oh, what's this?" And she said, "Oh, my fingers are tingling." So I knew it wasn't just me. This was another effect that was coming from this particular fruit. Now, when I went to explore the fruit, the trees that I found them in were all chopped. The forest was wiped out. It was destroyed.
Wow.
And there wasn't a thing left. So I had to try and find out what tree it was, what were these things, and it took about 4 years before I found another batch and found this particular fruit. And this fruit has something to do. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it has connections with the Middle East. It has connections with the people that built the passage chambers, the stone structures that are here, these doorways to the other worlds. This fruit also falls on the summer solstice. Not before. It falls on the solstice. And I got samples this year, and I had arranged with a laboratory to run tests. Everything was all great. Everything was fantastic, and suddenly the laboratory disappeared. They never responded to emails or phone calls. Nothing. They just vanished. Right at the 11th hour when I needed them, they vanished. But I was also dealing with a herbalist, and the reason why I split the samples in two is because the herbalist was dealing with the faith, with the spirituality. And so I needed his perspective as well, because these passage chambers were built heavily with spirituality in mind. So I needed his perspective as well. So he understands the chemicals of the land. He understands what plants are good for this and what plants are good for that. He'd never seen these before. And when I brought the two samples that had fallen on the summer solstice this year, I put them into a plastic bag, a clear plastic bag. And I went round to his house at 8 o'clock that night as the sun was starting to set. Now, when I reached across and grabbed the bag, the hair on my arms and my hands stood up on end. I knew something would, and it wasn't just subtle. This was very dramatic. I knew something was going on with these things. And I handed the bag across to him. He had both his hands out, and I set them into his hands in the plastic bag, and he looked at me and said, "Oh my God, what are these?" He got it too. Mm. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what he did say, his report was that these things sharpen the immune system, the circulatory system, and the reproductive system. They sharpen the process of the mind. It takes away the cloudiness of thought and makes you sharp. These things fell on the summer solstice to allow us to communicate with these things beyond the veil. That's what the book is about. It's about the discovery of that and what I'm discovering with it since.
We definitely have to talk more about that, although right now we can't. When is that book, do you think, going to come out?
Oh, who knows?
Okay, good. Well, you've got a date here. But anyway, we do have to go. I kind of like we're leaving everything with questions that people have in their minds about all that, the deception of the gods of Banshee. And this was a good tease show. It was, because now you're going to have to come back, So
I look forward to it, Marla.
In the meantime, where can people find you if they're looking for you?
I just opened up my new Facebook account, so people can find me, Barry Fitzgerald. There's nothing fancy, and they'll find me there. And I also have my website at charmstealer.com, and that's where they can get a lot of the books if they're interested. Yeah.
I can't wait. All right. So thank you. Thank you for staying up. Thank you for losing sleep over us. Appreciate it very, very much. And now, people know that you're back, and this is good, and you will be back.
I'm back, yeah. Oh,
yay.
Yes. Uh-huh. And I never get into the UFO thing. I forgot to tell you the story about the UFO. But anyway, we'll do that the next time.
Yes, and it will be soon, probably. Let's hope, because you've really got me. My questions and things are just running through my head. So thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for listening in tonight. And until next time, everybody, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time for another great guest and more fun. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2009.
You have been listening to the Para X Radio Network.